Could a government survive when the men holding the guns begin to hesitate? That question now hangs over Iran as the most serious internal challenge to the Islamic Republic in more than 4 decades unfolds in real time. What began as economic anger has evolved into something far more dangerous for any authoritarian system: visible cracks in the security bargain that has kept the regime alive since 1979. For 45 years, the ruling structure rested on a simple exchange: absolute loyalty from the security forces in return for protection, privilege, and immunity. Today, that exchange is under unprecedented strain. Here is the question viewers should consider from the start. If security forces stop believing the system can protect them, what happens next? The early signs suggest this calculation is already changing. Footage circulating from multiple Iranian provinces shows police officers and militia members laying down their weapons not under fire, but amid crowds that welcome them rather than attack them. These scenes matter not because of their scale alone, but because of what they signal psychologically. In authoritarian systems, perception often moves faster than reality. The timing of this shift is no accident. Iran's economic collapse has accelerated sharply over the past year. The rial has lost more than 80% of its value against the dollar, eroding salaries across the public sector, including for conscripts and junior officers. Analysts at Reuters and the BBC have noted that inflation in basic food and fuel costs now mirrors conditions seen during late-stage economic crises elsewhere, while sanctions enforcement has tightened under the current U.S. administration. With Donald Trump back in the White House, Washington has re-emphasized pressure rather than accommodation, closing loopholes that once softened the blow. History offers a warning here. Economic collapse alone rarely topples regimes. Venezuela endured hyperinflation, empty shelves, and mass emigration. Yet Nicolas Maduro remained in power because the military stayed loyal. Romania in 1989 followed a different path. Nicolae Ceausescu appeared firmly in control until soldiers refused to fire on protesters. Within days, his regime collapsed. Iran's leadership knows this history well, which is why it spent decades building overlapping security structures designed to prevent unified defection. That architecture is now being tested. The regular army, composed largely of conscripts drawn from the broader population, faces the same economic pressures as the protesters. Military analysts cited by Defense News and DW have long described this force as less ideological and more socially representative than the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. When hardship intensifies, loyalty becomes transactional rather than doctrinal. And transactions fail when one side believes the other can no longer deliver. The regime's response so far has been brutal but revealing. Internet blackouts, mass arrests, and lethal force have suppressed demonstrations temporarily, yet have not restored confidence inside the ranks. Even more telling was a brief public statement from an internal security body acknowledging concerns about abandonment within its own forces, language never used publicly in 4.5 decades. Though quickly deleted, it confirmed what analysts already suspected. The leadership is worried not just about protests, but about who will enforce the next order. Western experts point to a dangerous feedback loop now forming. According to assessments echoed by the Institute for the Study of War, once defections are seen as possible, they become contagious. Soldiers begin to calculate personal survival rather than ideological duty. Each visible act of hesitation lowers the threshold for the next. This is not rebellion yet, but it is something regimes fear almost as much uncertainty. For NATO and the broader West, the implications are strategic rather than moral. A destabilized Iran affects energy markets, regional security, and the balance of power across the Middle East. Under President Trump, U.S. officials have signaled that internal repression, combined with regional aggression, will meet firmer responses, not softer diplomacy. That posture adds external pressure to internal strain, compressing timelines and narrowing options for Tehran's leadership. Yet the system has not collapsed. The IRGC still controls vast economic assets, parallel command structures, and powerful enforcement tools. History shows that regimes often appear weakest just before they either fall or strike back with overwhelming force. The real question is whether loyalty can still be bought when belief has begun to erode. Meanwhile, as chants grow louder in city streets and silence spreads through official channels, what followed next began to alarm analysts watching not the crowds, but the quiet inside Iran's barracks. When guns hesitate, regimes listen, and in Iran, hesitation is no longer theoretical. It is visible, documented, and spreading in ways that security planners once considered unthinkable. Videos verified by multiple international outlets show police officers lowering weapons and stepping aside as crowds surge forward, not to attack, but to embrace them. These moments, captured across provinces from the west to the south, mark a psychological breach more significant than any single clash. Authority once enforced by fear is being negotiated in public view. A critical question emerges early for audiences watching these developments unfold. If defections begin quietly and locally, how quickly can they cascade nationwide? The evidence suggests that the answer depends less on numbers and more on visibility. Analysts at Reuters have noted that abandonment of posts rather than open mutiny has become the dominant pattern. In several locations, security units did not fight or surrender. They simply left. Bases associated with auxiliary forces were found empty hours before protesters arrived. In authoritarian systems, abandonment is often the prelude to collapse. The regime's layered security model was designed precisely to prevent this. The regular army, the paramilitary auxiliary forces, and the elite guard corps were structured to watch one another, ensuring no single institution could defect without being crushed by the others. Yet this redundancy has become a liability. Each force now wonders whether the others will still stand firm if ordered to escalate violence further. That uncertainty slows response times, blunts coordination, and erodes deterrence. Economic pressure amplifies this hesitation. Defense analysts writing in Military Watch magazine have emphasized that junior officers and conscripts are among the hardest hit by Iran's financial collapse. Salaries lag far behind inflation, while savings evaporate almost overnight. The psychological contract, risk your life today, secure your future tomorrow, no longer holds. When soldiers see families struggling to afford basic necessities, ideological loyalty becomes harder to sustain. There is also a generational dimension. Younger personnel consume the same fragmented information as protesters, even amid internet restrictions. Despite blackouts, content spreads through satellite links, messaging apps, and word of mouth. Al Jazeera reporting highlights how chants aimed directly at police units calling them to join the nation are crafted not as threats, but as invitations. This framing matters. It offers an exit rather than a confrontation, lowering the perceived cost of defection. Western intelligence assessments reportedly view this as a dangerous inflection point. According to commentary referenced by the New York Times, regimes rarely fall because crowds grow larger. They fall when security forces doubt enforcement will be rewarded. The calculus shifts from obedience to survival. Officers begin to ask whether following orders today could make them targets tomorrow. That fear is now visible in hesitation captured on camera. The leadership's response has been mixed and revealing. Publicly, officials insist that loyalty remains intact and discipline absolute. Privately, emergency rotations, tightened vetting, and internal surveillance have intensified. Such measures may slow defections in the short term, but they also deepen mistrust within the ranks. Experts warn that excessive internal policing accelerates the very outcome it seeks to prevent, as soldiers begin to feel trapped rather than protected. For NATO and Western planners, these developments carry strategic weight. A destabilizing Iran does not exist in isolation. Energy markets, regional proxy dynamics, and maritime security all hinge on internal cohesion in Tehran. Under President Trump, U.S. policy has emphasized readiness and deterrence, signaling that internal repression combined with regional escalation could provoke swift responses. That external pressure sharpens internal anxieties, particularly among mid-level commanders. Yet hesitation does not equal defection, at least not yet. The core enforcement units remain intact, and the state still possesses overwhelming coercive power. History shows that regimes often survive the first wave of uncertainty by forcing clarity through violence or concessions. The question is which path Iran chooses and whether those ordered to enforce it will comply. Yet as hesitation spreads quietly from street corners to command rooms, what followed next shocked analysts watching not the protests themselves, but the behavior of Iran's leadership at the very top. Why do some authoritarian regimes endure economic ruin, while others collapse almost overnight? The answer history shows lies not in the streets, but inside the barracks. As Iran's unrest deepens, analysts increasingly frame the situation through comparative precedence cases where governments either survived extreme pressure or disintegrated with stunning speed. These comparisons are no longer academic. They are shaping how Tehran, Washington, and NATO capitals interpret what comes next. A key question for viewers at this stage is unavoidable. Which historical path is Iran now following? Endurance like Venezuela or sudden collapse like Romania? The distinction hinges on one factor alone: whether soldiers continue to obey orders when obedience becomes personally dangerous. Venezuela's experience is instructive. Despite hyperinflation, food shortages, and mass emigration, Nicolas Maduro survived because the armed forces remained loyal. Officers were rewarded, shielded, and integrated into the state's economic lifelines. The guns stayed pointed outward. Romania in 1989 followed a different trajectory. Nicolae Ceausescu appeared unshakable until a single moment of hesitation cascaded through the military. When soldiers refused to fire on demonstrators, the regime's authority evaporated within days. The state did not lose its weapons. It lost the will of those ordered to use them. Iran's leadership has studied this lesson for decades and designed its system to avoid it. That design explains the creation of parallel security forces, ideological vetting, and economic privileges tied to loyalty. The elite Guard Corps functions not just as a military unit, but as a political insurance policy. Yet the very complexity of this system now introduces new vulnerabilities. Western analysts cited by the BBC and Defense News argue that overlapping chains of command slow decisive action during crises. When each force monitors the other, trust erodes under stress. Recent reporting suggests this erosion is no longer theoretical. A brief internal acknowledgement of potential abandonment within elite ranks, later withdrawn, marked a watershed moment. For 45 years, such concerns were managed quietly, never admitted publicly. Experts described the deletion itself as evidence of panic. Leaders realized that acknowledging doubt could accelerate it. In authoritarian psychology, belief in inevitability is often more important than reality. The economic dimension reinforces these historical parallels. In Venezuela, military elites were insulated from collapse through access to resources and smuggling networks. In Romania, by contrast, hardship penetrated the officer corps, undermining loyalty. Iran's situation appears closer to the latter. While senior commanders retain access to wealth, junior officers and conscripts face the same inflation and shortages as civilians. According to analyses referenced by DW, this asymmetry fuels resentment within the ranks. Strategically, this matters beyond Iran's borders. NATO planners view regime stability in Tehran as a variable affecting everything from Gulf shipping lanes to energy prices and regional proxy conflicts. Under President Trump, U.S. policy has emphasized deterrence and readiness rather than gradual engagement. That posture amplifies pressure on Iranian leadership while signaling to security forces that external consequences could follow internal violence. Yet caution remains warranted. History also shows that regimes can recover from moments of doubt by reasserting control through selective force or concessions. The presence of hesitation does not guarantee defection, and defection does not guarantee collapse. What matters is momentum, and momentum often turns on elite behavior rather than popular sentiment. Analysts increasingly focus on signals from the top. When leaders project confidence, uncertainty can be contained. When they appear fearful, doubt spreads downward. That dynamic sets the stage for the next phase of this crisis, where attention shifts from the streets and the soldiers to the behavior of Iran's inner circle itself. Yet, as comparisons with past collapses sharpen what followed next. Surprised observers not in the squares or the barracks, but in the quiet movements of those closest to power. If uncertainty is spreading downward through Iran's security forces, fear appears to be moving upward toward the very top of the system. In recent weeks, a series of subtle but telling signals has emerged from within Iran's leadership signals that analysts describe as indicators of internal panic rather than public confidence. These are not shouted declarations or televised speeches. They are quiet adjustments, indirect admissions, and financial movements that often precede major political ruptures. One question now presses itself forward. Why would a regime that claims full control behave as if it is preparing for the possibility of sudden loss? The answer may lie in how leaders themselves are recalculating risk. According to reporting cited by Reuters and echoed by several European intelligence briefings, senior figures appear increasingly isolated from regular channels of governance. Decision-making has narrowed contact, has become more centralized, and reliance on elite security structures has intensified classic symptoms of a leadership that trusts fewer and fewer people. Perhaps the most revealing indicator came from within the elite security apparatus itself. A short-lived internal acknowledgement of potential abandonment within the ranks, quickly withdrawn, represented an unprecedented breach of silence. Analysts described it not as a warning to soldiers, but as an admission to fellow elites that loyalty can no longer be assumed. In authoritarian systems, such acknowledgements are avoided at all costs because they puncture the myth of inevitability. Once inevitability fades, fear fills the vacuum. Financial behavior adds another layer to this picture. Western intelligence and financial monitoring agencies have reported unusual patterns of capital movement linked to Iranian elites. Tens of millions of dollars have reportedly been transferred abroad through indirect channels, according to commentary cited by major U.S. financial outlets. While not illegal in isolation, the timing is critical. Regimes confident in their survival do not quietly secure exit options. Elites preparing for uncertainty do. This behavior sends a powerful signal to the security forces watching from below. Soldiers and police officers may tolerate hardship, but they rarely accept being the last ones standing for leaders who appear ready to flee. Military sociologists frequently note that visible elite exit behavior accelerates defection far more effectively than protest slogans. Loyalty erodes fastest when sacrifice is perceived as one-sided. Inside the leadership circle, concern appears to focus less on the protests themselves and more on who can still be trusted to suppress them. Analysts at Defense News have pointed out that emergency coordination increasingly bypasses traditional institutions concentrating authority within a shrinking group of loyalists. This may ensure short-term control, but it also signals weakness. Narrow systems are brittle. When they fail quickly. For Western governments especially, NATO members, these signs alter strategic calculations. A leadership under internal stress is more unpredictable abroad. It may escalate regionally to project strength or clamp down domestically in ways that trigger wider instability. Under President Trump, U.S. policy has emphasized readiness for both contingencies, reinforcing deterrence, while signaling that internal repression will not be ignored. That external pressure compounds internal anxiety rather than relieving it. Experts caution against assuming collapse is imminent. Authoritarian regimes have survived elite panic before by reasserting discipline through force or patronage. Yet the convergence of internal doubt, economic strain, and visible elite hedging narrows the margin for error. Every decision now carries amplified consequences, and every misstep risks accelerating the very outcome leaders fear. As attention shifts from the streets to the corridors of power, the next question becomes unavoidable. How will external pressure intersect with internal fragility, and will it stabilize the system or push it closer to a breaking point? What followed next forced analysts to widen their focus beyond Iran's borders altogether. As Iran's internal cohesion weakens, external pressure is no longer a distant backdrop. It is actively shaping calculations inside the country. Governments rarely collapse in isolation, and in this case, the international environment is tightening at the same moment internal trust is fraying. The intersection of domestic unrest and foreign signaling has created a strategic squeeze that analysts say leaves little room for error. The question viewers should weigh at this stage is direct. When a regime faces internal doubt, does outside pressure stabilize it or accelerate its unraveling under President Donald Trump? Washington has chosen a posture that emphasizes deterrence and readiness rather than restraint. Recent U.S. statements have made clear that large-scale violence against civilians would not be viewed as an internal matter alone. This shift matters because it changes the perceived costs of obedience for those ordered to carry out repression. Military movements reinforce that message. According to reporting from Reuters and Defense News, U.S. forces have quietly repositioned assets across the region, including air and missile defense capabilities. Officials describe these moves as precautionary, yet the pattern mirrors earlier periods of heightened tension. Such deployments serve a dual purpose. They deter regional escalation and signal to Iranian decision-makers that options are narrowing. For security forces inside Iran, this reinforces the sense that the current moment is different from past crises. Economic pressure is also intensifying. Sanctions enforcement has become more rigorous, targeting not only state institutions, but networks linked to senior figures. Western financial authorities have emphasized real-time monitoring of capital flows, reducing the ability of elites to shield assets abroad discreetly. Analysts cited by the New York Times argue that this financial constriction amplifies internal mistrust, as officers wonder whether loyalty will still be rewarded if the system's resources dry up. The broader geopolitical context adds further strain. NATO planners view instability in Iran through the lens of energy security and regional balance. Disruptions ripple across oil markets, shipping routes, and proxy conflicts, stretching from the Levant to the Gulf. Under Trump's administration, coordination with allies has focused on readiness rather than mediation, reflecting a belief that deterrence works best when ambiguity is reduced. That clarity, however, also raises stakes inside Iran's command structures. Expert assessments diverge on outcomes. Some analysts argue that external pressure historically strengthens authoritarian regimes by allowing leaders to frame unrest as foreign-backed. Others counter that this strategy fails when economic pain and elite doubt already dominate internal narratives. Al Jazeera commentary has highlighted how younger security personnel appear less responsive to nationalist framing, focusing instead on personal futures rather than ideological confrontation. What is clear is that the convergence of internal fragility and external pressure compresses time. Decisions that once unfolded over months now carry consequences within days. A misjudged crackdown could trigger wider defections. A perceived retreat could embolden protests. The margin for controlled escalation is shrinking rapidly. For Western policymakers, this creates a dilemma. Too much pressure risks pushing the system toward violent implosion. Too little may prolong repression without resolution. For Iran's security forces, the dilemma is even starker. Each order now comes with an implicit question. Will compliance protect them or leave them exposed when the balance shifts? As foreign signals grow louder and internal silence deepens, analysts are now asking whether the crisis has entered its final phase or whether the system still has one decisive move left. What followed next reframed the entire debate, shifting focus from pressure and panic to the ultimate question of tipping points. Is Iran approaching a tipping point or entering another prolonged cycle of repression and survival? That question now dominates assessments from Washington to Brussels, from intelligence agencies to academic institutes. After weeks of unrest, hesitation within the security forces, elite anxiety, and mounting external pressure, analysts are increasingly focused on scenarios rather than slogans. The future of the Islamic Republic no longer hinges on whether protests continue, but on how the system responds to compounded stress without a clear exit strategy. The central question for audiences at this stage is stark. What happens if hesitation turns into momentum? History suggests that tipping points are rarely announced. They emerge when several conditions converge: economic collapse, sustained unrest, elite fear, and visible cracks in enforcement. According to multiple Western analysts cited by Reuters and the Atlantic Council, Iran is now closer to that convergence than at any time since the early years of the Republic. Yet collapse is not inevitable. The state still retains formidable tools. The elite guard controls key economic sectors, communications, infrastructure, and rapid response units. These assets can suppress unrest, temporarily buying time for internal consolidation. Military experts writing in defense news caution that regimes often appear weakest just before reasserting control through decisive if brutal action. The absence of mass defections from elite units remains a critical stabilizing factor. However, the structural problems facing Iran limit long-term recovery. Economic forecasts published by international financial institutions point to continued contraction, declining energy revenues, and reduced foreign currency reserves. Even if protests subside, the underlying drivers, youth unemployment, inflation, and isolation, remain unresolved. Western experts increasingly describe the system as resilient but brittle, capable of absorbing shocks, yet vulnerable to sudden fracture if pressure exceeds a narrow threshold. For NATO and U.S. planners, this creates a landscape defined by risk management rather than resolution. A sudden collapse could destabilize energy markets and regional security. A prolonged crackdown risks humanitarian fallout and escalatory behavior abroad. Under President Trump, U.S. policy has leaned toward deterrence combined with preparedness, signaling that while regime change is not declared policy, violent spillover will meet firm responses. Inside Iran, the most consequential decisions are now being made quietly, far from cameras. Mid-level commanders weigh orders against personal futures. Civil servants watch elite behavior for cues. Ordinary citizens measure risk against exhaustion. In such moments, perception becomes reality. If enough actors believe the system is weakening, they act accordingly, and those actions can make belief self-fulfilling. Western analysts emphasize that no single trigger will decide Iran's fate. Rather, it will be a sequence of choices, miscalculations, and reactions. A harsh crackdown could deter protests, but deepen elite fear. Restraint could preserve lives but embolden dissent. Each path carries costs the system can increasingly ill afford. As this phase unfolds, observers are left with a final unsettling uncertainty. Authoritarian regimes often fall not when they are challenged, but when those tasked with defending them no longer believe the future lies on that side. Whether Iran's security forces reach that conclusion en masse remains unknown, but the question itself would have been unthinkable just months ago. What do you think happens next in Iran? Does the system adapt and endure, or are these the early signs of irreversible change? And if you want to follow how this story develops in real time, would staying subscribed help you keep track of what comes